Hello, I'm Nancy Lee, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this discussion on the critical challenges of strengthening the regulatory environment for infrastructure investment, both public and private. There's no more pressing priority for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals than financing and building the right kind of infrastructure. Green infrastructure that reduces carbon emissions, and infrastructure that promotes growth and connects the poor, vulnerable, and excluded to productive economic activity and to essential goods and services. Infrastructure investment entails a wide range of risks, but surveys suggest that some of the most important in the eyes of investors come from governments, either their actions or their inaction. Data show large inefficiency in publicly funded infrastructure. The IMF estimates that on average, countries waste about a third of their infrastructure spending due to inefficiencies, corruption, delays, cost overruns. But on the positive side, the IMF also estimates that more than half of these losses could be made up with better infrastructure governance and better infrastructure regulation. During this COVID era, with its enormous fiscal pressures, no country, certainly not poor countries, can afford large and avoidable spending inefficiencies. So that's one reason why the World Bank's report benchmarking infrastructure development 2020 is so important. It is a unique public good, as we'll hear. It assesses regulatory quality for infrastructure PPPs across 140 economies. The other reason is that we're just not seeing an upward trend in private finance for infrastructure in emerging and developing economies. Globally, infrastructure transactions that include private finance totaled about 97 billion for all developing economies in 2019. And compare that to infrastructure financing gaps in the trillions. And despite all the talk about billions to trillions, that number has remained roughly flat for about 3 years, and it's sharply down from its peak in 2012. And that was before COVID. Making the investment environment for all infrastructure more attractive to private investors has to be a priority for all governments striving to build back better. We have an excellent panel today to discuss the report, and I'll introduce them later. And I invite you in the audience to participate in the conversation at the end of the panel. You can do so in 3 different ways. You can tweet at CGDev, hashtag CGD Talks. You can email events@cgdev.org, and you can comment in the YouTube chat window. But first, we are fortunate to have with us today Fernanda Ruiz Nunez, Senior Infrastructure Economist in the Public-Private Partnership Group of the World Bank. Fernanda led the team that prepared the report and will start us off today by describing its findings. Fernanda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Let me share the presentation. Let me see, here it is. Thank you very much, everybody, all the participants today. I would also like to thank the Center for Global Development for hosting today's event, and the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, who has supported financially our initiative. I will be very brief today. I will go over a presentation of around 15 minutes. And I will try to present the very high level messages, hopefully to have a longer discussion with the panel, since we have such excellent panelists today. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. So basically, we started this initiative in 2015 with the pilot of 10 economies and was only focused on PPPs. And we have been scaling up over time. And today in 2020, we have covered 140 countries. And we have actually increased also the thematic scope to include traditional public investment in 40 economies. And we also have a pilot on practice or implementation questions. So the thing is, what does this initiative, what is the objective of this initiative? What we try to do is basically to assess the quality of the legal and regulatory framework to prepare, procure, and manage large infrastructure projects. And we do that by benchmarking against international recognized good practices. And we use basically a regulatory-based survey. And we generate indicators that are measurable, verifiable, and actionable. And it's very important, the actionable part, because basically this gives governments the opportunity to have a critical view, understand what are the areas that they can improve, and hopefully motivate them to reforms that will lead to better quality of their regulatory framework for both traditional public investment and public-private partnerships. As I said, we covered 140 countries. If you look in this map, you will see in red, we have 40 countries that are pilot for traditional public investment. The red and the blue are the 140 countries that we covered for PPPs. So we have a quite a vast geographical coverage. I will encourage the participants to go after this event and click in our website, and you can actually zoom in particular countries and get information at the country level, all the survey, all the answers. I think it will be very useful. With respect to the thematic coverage, for both PPP and TPIs, we follow the project cycle, starting from preparation, procurement, contract management. For the case of PPPs, in addition, we have a special module of unsolicited proposals. In the case of traditional public investments, since we only cover the construction phase, we also have a special module on assessment management and operation and maintenance. We also collect information about the regulatory framework and the institutional arrangement, but we do not score those sections. It's only for background purposes. So as I said, I will present very high level and results, and we have, of course, much more information in the website and in the report. So let me start first with public-private partnerships, the main finding, and I will go over preparation, procurement, and contract management. Let's start then with preparation. In preparation, I think there is the important message that we have in the preparation phase is that this is the areas in which we see that there is more room for improvement. Now, the good news is that when we compare the results that we have in 2018 with the results of 2020, we find that 33 countries have introduced reforms by adopting one or more good international practices in the preparation of PPPs. Of course, there is still room for improvement. So let me give you two examples. Here, there is less than a quarter of economies that require a procurement strategy before the tendering process. This is quite important because it allows the government to look at the options that they have to procure and develop a project. And there is also another important thing, for example, is market sounding. We also assess all type of assessments that are required before the tendering process starts. And market sounding is the area in which we see less countries adopting that, requiring that assessment. But when we look specifically at market sounding that is specifically designed to bring opportunities for innovation, only 4% of the countries require that. That is very important for the private sector if we want the private sector to bring new technical solutions for the development of projects. So a very high level, again, when we look, for example, at the aggregate levels, at the aggregate scores by region or by income level, in the case of preparation, here you will see in the blue bars basically indicate the legal scores. The light blue indicate the practice score. What you see and will only see in preparation is that practice score tend to be higher than legal score. This is actually good news if you look about it, because it means that in general, in the preparation phase, countries are actually implementing good practices, even though they are not required by regulations. Let me go at the procurement phase of PPPs. Here we see two good news. So overall, we have assessed all the good practices in terms during the tendering process. The good news is that between 2019 and 2020, that is the only period we can compare, we see that 14% of the economies have adopted some type of reform that make more procurement methods available during tendering process. This is important for countries to have the possibility to fit better the way in which they will basically procure projects. And another important thing is that, for example, we only find that 18% of the countries require at least a minimum of 60 days to submit bids. That time is very important to allow for competition. The good news is that even though this percentage is very low, 9% more countries have adopted reforms in the last 2 years to increase the minimum time to submit bids and therefore allow for more competition. If we look at overall trends in geographical trends and income trends, what you will observe here is that in the case of procurement, the practice scores or the implementation scores are lower than the regulatory scores. And that gap is much bigger for low-income countries. What it means is basically that especially low-income countries face major challenges in the implementing the regulatory requirements. Now let's go to PPP contract management. So it's the phase basically after you sign the contract and now you need to monitor and manage that contract. What we find is that we review basically 18 international good practices, and more than half of the countries that we review adopted at least 14 of those good practices. The problem that we see is that still we see some problems in disclosure of performance information. If you look at this graph, only 16% of the economies require that the performance information during the operation phase is published online, and only 13% require that the performance information during the construction phase is published online. So what do we see in terms of trends on contract management? Contract management is the area in which we see in general higher scores overall, and still there is a gap between legal scores and practice score. So still we see, except for the case of East Asia, in general countries basically face some challenges in terms of the implementation of those regulations. So let me go now to traditional public investment. Traditional public investment is basically public procurement. And what we do here, as I said, and I want you to keep that in mind, this is only for a sample of 40 countries, since this was our pilot in this 2020 edition. And what we find in terms of preparation is that, so overall, we see, and as I mentioned in the PPP, actually, this is the area in which we see there is more room for improvement. And we see that only, for example, just to give you one example, only 1/3 of the economies check whether TPI is the best option against other alternatives. For example, checking you should procure this project as a PPP or as a traditional public procurement. Only 1/3 of the economies do that. When we go and check, do you have a methodology to make this consistent? Only 15% actually have a clear methodology to determine to check what is the best procurement option for the development of a project. In the case of procurement of TPI, what we see is that most of the basic elements of the procurement system are widespread. Now, that is not surprising, I think, because public procurement has been around for a long time. So there was time, to enhance, to introduce reforms and enhance the procurement phase. Still, there are good international good practices that are still not adopted, and there is important room for improvement. For example, it's considered a good practice to include very clearly the standstill period in the award notice. And however, only 10% of the countries that have that requirement. The same is with respect to transparency during the bidding proceeding. And we see that only 10% of the countries have some way of providing a transparent process, during the bidding proceeding. For example, recording it or basically carrying it out live online. with respect to contract management, what we see is that contract management is still the area in which we see more adoption of good practices in general. Still here, we see the issue in which, for example, disclosure performance of information is rare. The disclosure of performance information during the construction phase is basically only required in 23% of the countries. And another important characteristic, for example, is that there is a specific requirement of qualification for the team that will be in charge to manage the contract. And we see that only 23% of the economies require to have those minimum qualifications. So let me conclude with some main trends that we observe, and probably your take-home messages is that when we see, we see is that something that is not surprising for anybody, the higher the income level, the better the performance. I think this is what we all probably expected ex ante. The important information that we have here is that preparation is the area in which we see more room for improvement across income levels and in both PPPs and traditional public investments. The other message is that, and here we compare basically, as I said, we have 40 countries in which we do the pilot for traditional public investment, and we also have PPP, so these 40 country overlaps. When we compare these 40 countries, what we find is that obviously PPP, we know for the information before that is the area that require more improvement. That is important because basically we always hear from the private sector saying that one of the main constraints to invest in infrastructure is that there are no good, very well prepared projects. And actually this is the area in which we see more room for improvement. And in addition to that, you see that PPPs tend to perform lower than traditional public investment. Not surprising again, because public procurement have been for longer time, so more time for reforms. The other important and last message for me is this gap between the legal and the practice score. You see that gap being bigger for contract management. So while we see that the scores are higher for contract management, a higher adoption of good practices, you see that the gap between the legal and the practice score is bigger for contract management. So with that, let me conclude my presentation. As I said, I was super brief. I hope the participants can go to a website. It's an interactive website, and you can actually go and enter all the information about, you can get the whole survey, the regulatory basis for all the answers. You can check your country, compare with others, and I hope you find them very useful. Thank you very much, and back to you, Nancy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fernanda. That was an excellent summary of a huge amount of really useful information, and I hope everyone does go to the website and dive into the report. Now we can have a conversation with our panelists, and let me introduce each of them first and then pose a few questions. We have, first of all, Imad Fakouri, who is the Global Director, Infrastructure Finance, PPPs and Guarantees at the World Bank. He served in multiple ministerial roles in Jordan, including planning, public sector development, and management of mega projects. John Jorstad is the Chief Operating Officer of KPMG Impact, a global network of professionals delivering industry-leading practices. He works with cities, governments, and businesses to help them manage infrastructure assets. We have Anne-Marie Thurber. She's Executive Director of the group head of export and agency finance for the Americas at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. Her experience includes complex transactions in infrastructure, as well as social entrepreneurship, trade credits, and political risk insurance. And finally, Rafael Ugaz, who's the Executive Director of Pro Inversión Peru, a government agency whose mission is to promote private investment in the country. He has long experience in infrastructure projects, including PPPs and project finance, both in Peru and in other parts of the world. So a very distinguished panel with a variety of perspectives. So perhaps I can start with Rafael, who's in the trenches in Peru in promoting private investment. So Peru's scores for many aspects of the PPP regulatory framework are above average for the region, for the global, above average for the global average, and above average for Peru's country income group. And this is the case for project preparation, contract management, and for regulating unsolicited proposals. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see in terms of the benefits of this regulatory performance? Are you seeing more cost efficiency? Is private investment in infrastructure in Peru actually increasing? And maybe you could give us a sense of which sectors do best with respect to using the PPP as a investment framework.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to participate in this panel. So it's a very good question. I mean, I would ask by first try to define how we measure performance, which has been an issue, I think, in structuring PPPs in Peru and maybe elsewhere. I think this could be more so in the case of Peru, where Proinversión, which is basically the P3 procurement agency, our mandate is from structuring to transaction. So we receive the mandate from the Ministry of Transportation of Energy, then we structure and we run the transaction. And once we award the contract, then we hand it over back to the ministry, and with some involvement from the regulator. So I think in the past, the performance of our actions were focused on awarding the project, right? And on that behalf, in the past, we could have seen better performance, so the shorter time frame in the structuring and transaction phase. But if we measure by when the project is delivered and when the infrastructure is in service, maybe less so, because we have experienced in the past some delays, some issues to reach financial closing, or projects having to sign or negotiate addendums to the contract, right? Or running into problems in execution. So I think the performance, we need to focus on what means performance, right? Infrastructure delivered, and then nowadays what we are seeing, and I think this is part of what Fernanda is referring to, I think we have seen an evolution in the regulatory framework, right? Peru has almost 20 years. Our PPP framework has 20 years, and it has been evolving over time. I think I would say in the past, there was less checks and balances. Proinversión was leading the process. Now, starting in 2015, there have been some changes that targeted or were attempted to incorporate lessons learned, best practices from other parts of the world, and I think those were good enhancement to the regulatory framework. There was another enhancement in 2016 and 2018. I think nowadays we see more checks and balances, which is positive. I think the benefits is we have more transparency, but probably the benefits of these enhancements are about to be seen yet, because we probably were taking a little bit longer structuring projects now, because we have more touch points with the agencies, with the ministry, with the regulator, with the Ministry of Finance. But we expect that the benefit is going to be that our projects are better or more baked when they reach the market. So we expect not as many delays during the execution process as we have experienced in the past, right? So I would say those are the benefits, but we are about to see the impact of those enhancements in the future. Regarding the costs, yeah, I guess that's the trade-off, right? I mean, we have added more checks and balances, and therefore the day-to-day job of Proinversión is a little bit more tricky because we need to interact with more stakeholders to get their involvement and their buy-in to before we launch the projects to the market, right? And that's, I think I would say there's a learning curve because we have added more responsibility to other stakeholders. But we need, maybe we're in the process and there's some opportunities to improve how we behave or how each stakeholder takes a role and have maybe better divisions of responsibilities, because there seems to be an overlap in some cases between the Ministry of Finance, the regulator, the controller. And those are the things that we are working right now. Regarding to your question about sectors, I think the PPPs work better in those sectors that have more of a tradition and are more familiar with PPPs. What I'm referring to is that a sector like transportation or energy, who have a tradition in the Ministry of Transportation or Energy, which has a tradition on launching or running PPP projects. I think they're more used, they have the team's capacity. There are other type of new infrastructure that we're developing under PPP frameworks, like hospitals and schools. And then the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education, they are less familiar with this. So there's a learning curve there. And I think what I would say is that we need to strengthen the institutions on the other side, the entities that mandate the PPP projects to Proinversión. And that would allow to facilitate and take the best out of PPP projects in Peru.
Thanks, Rafael. That's a really useful description of the trade-offs. You know, what the additional time you may take in the structuring process, you may make up when you're actually trying to launch the project in markets. And so it may take less time to get the project taken up by the markets because of the increased quality of the project. So I think that's a really useful point. So let's turn to the private sector now to get Anne-Marie's perspective. Latin Finance awarded SMBC its Project and Infrastructure Bank of the Year award in 2019. So SMBC is clearly a leader in the infrastructure finance and committed to Latin America. So what does your bank pay most attention to in terms of the regulatory environment in its infrastructure finance decisions? And, you know, I mentioned the global infrastructure transaction value, at least projects with private finance, that's sort of stuck below $100 billion for a number of years now. What would you say to developing economies in terms of how they can boost those numbers? Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thanks for the invitation to participate in, excuse me, in this forum. Yes, thank you. We are quite honored to have been recognized for a fourth consecutive year. So, you know, in terms of at the most basic level, we're looking for a solid regulatory regime. I mean, that really is a must. And then after the regulatory regime, I guess, existing, then the next question is, well, is it proven or not, right? In Latin America, we're active in 6 or 7 different countries and are carefully evaluating the PPP regimes in 1 or 2 more. Given the scale considerations, these tend to be in the larger economies, but we are open to opportunities in smaller, sort of countries, smaller, economies such as, in the Caribbean and such as Aruba. And while a proven regime is ideal, we are willing to work with new regulatory approaches, and in terms of engaging with governments and other stakeholders as they are formulating these possible new regimes, and sort of giving our input as as a bank that's very experienced in these areas. And one case in point is as Colombia was evaluating the regime, its regulatory regime for the 4G toll roads. In this case, we engaged with government and ANI as well as FDN, and just to give our input and perspective and experience with toll roads and different regulatory regimes, not only within Latin America, but also drawing on the experience and expertise of our global project finance team. While we were very comfortable with Colombia, as a whole, we really, wanted to make sure that we well understood the new requirements, regulatory requirements with respect to the 4G. And, while not all of our comments were necessarily incorporated, which of course we wouldn't expect, but we were, during this engagement, we fully understood and were comfortable with the final result. And in fact, we were one of the first banks to finance a 4G toll road in Colombia. And we also, as Argentina was looking to engage in its toll road development, we took a similar approach, and we are always happy to engage with the various stakeholders as we are as they are contemplating regulatory regime changes.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. And yeah, I guess that's one of the huge advantages of being a global institution. You basically, you're seeing regulatory changes and building regulatory systems all over the world, and you can bring best practice suggestions on best practice to different regions. So some more private sector perspective, John. What are your clients looking for in terms of advice and assistance on infrastructure regulation? And I mentioned earlier that the IMF finds these really large cost inefficiencies, but on the positive side, estimates that more than half can be made up through better infrastructure governance and regulation. So, if you had to identify the regulatory reforms with the greatest bang for the buck, both for fully publicly financed projects and for PPPs, what would be your top 3 or 4 list?
I wish it was that easy. But thank you, first of all, for inviting me to participate today. And I'd like to congratulate Fernanda on an excellent report, which is not only an insightful report, but it also shows that the massive amount of room for improvement that there is across a lot of these areas that are highlighted in the report. When it comes to what KPMG is advising clients on in this space, I would go in 2 different buckets, because we work both with public sector clients and regulatory authorities in terms of managing their program and how they are going to market with the regulation. And for that segment of our client group, they're looking for innovation, best practice, value for money. And then the other side of the coin is obviously with the private sector. The private sector is looking for performance. So how can they achieve the best return on investment while also providing the best service possible? Private sector is looking really at this as regulation as a catalyst for transformation. So in some of the more advanced regulatory markets, you see the private sector and the regulator working quite closely together towards a collective objective in terms of the future state of what they want the, if it's the water sector, for example, what they want the water market to look like in 10 years time, and that journey that you need to go on from where you are today to where you want to be over that point. And I highlight that because I think that is really relevant for the Sustainable Development Goals and the decade of action that we're in at the moment around trying to transform our economies from where we were to where we want to be in 10 years time. And then the final thing that I would highlight from the private sector perspective is risk management. Again, trying to get to a climate ready future. How do we manage that transition and the risks around that? And what the public-private partnership model has always been very good at, it's isolating risks and allocating that risk towards the party that's best able to manage it. And so I'll pause there and go back to you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, there's some skepticism about the PPP model because the contracts are complicated. But as you say, the benefit of that complicated contract is that you are in fact identifying risks very specifically and sharing them. So
just one other point. I guess you did ask me on the governance and the regulation. The one point I wanted to make on governance is that governance drives better decision making, and as was pointed out, the increased governance at the front of a project might increase the cost and the development time, but that pays dividends down the road. And on the regulation, again, that's really the public sector's lever to initiate the change it wants to see.
Okay, so now I think I'm happy to turn to Imad to give some reaction from the broader World Bank perspective. And I have to congratulate you, Imad, on and all of your team on this excellent tool for the countries, for the investors, and for analysts and economists and infrastructure finance specialists. So I was particularly struck by the report's finding that only half of the economies have the methodologies to ensure effective and consistent evaluation of fiscal affordability, risk analysis, and value for money, and only a third, as Fernanda was pointing out, of countries report assessing the best procurement alternative, and only half have methodologies for determining the best form of procurement. So all of this struck me as the data which help us understand the reasons for the IMF results on cost efficiency. So I wanted to ask you, how is the bank helping its country partners with these challenges? And what are governments asking for? And how is the bank responding to these challenges? Imad.
Nancy, thank you. Great pleasure to be with all of you today. Let us remember that this report is very much about infrastructure good governance, which is a critical and essential ingredient for the World Bank holistic approach and work in infrastructure sectors at the planning, enabling, environment, and the project levels. We also know that the changing infrastructure demands, and especially now with the also post-COVID new normal we're coping with, we've also experienced big reductions in fiscal resources. So these make good governance reforms informed by this report's systematic assessment and the work we do in countries through infrastructure diagnostics and other advisory work very critical, even more critical to ensure sustainable, affordable, and cost-efficient infrastructure. This World Bank work in totality plays an important role in mobilizing financing, both from public as well as from private sources. And we are very much familiar with the high estimated infrastructure financing gap that you referred to, Nancy. It is the case, however, that this financing gap is to a large extent, we could argue, a governance gap. So improving the PPP and the traditional public infrastructure regulatory frameworks are critical to ensure that public resources are spent more efficiently and to also increase the volume of private investment and finance that we can bring into these sectors. But let us also remember what is behind these infrastructure gaps. Only 57% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa are connected to electricity. Close to 800 million people are facing actually the threat of COVID without basic level of water services. Over 2 million don't have a toilet. Only 35% of the population in developing countries have access to the internet. It is very important to understand what's behind that also. And let us remember that private participation in infrastructure that we track through our PPI databases within our global practice, on average has been 9 to 13% of the total infrastructure investments coming into emerging and developing market economies. Yet, as we heard, there's, of course, from our private sector colleagues, there's a glut of private funds internationally looking for better returns. And we need to help countries unlock access to probably over 80 trillion in long-term investor asset base, who under certain conditions, if fulfilled, they could actually be crowded in. And many of those conditions are, the topic of our discussion today. So the first step is pointing out the problem, as we're trying to do today. It's assessing individual countries' performance relative to their peers and international best practice. That's precisely why we've been committed to this report at the World Bank, at the Infrastructure Practice Group. Though it takes, by the way, tremendous amount of time and resources to get this level of detail from every country. This is truly a Herculean task, and I want to really applaud my team for taking this on so diligently. I want to also thank the Australian government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their generous financial and moral support to this work. So what happens when a government is falling short in ways that bring inefficiency to spending and the development of the right infrastructure for their needs? In many cases, we find that there is some sort of political will that could be engaged, but technical expertise is lacking. So governments do come to the World Bank for tools, advice, technical assistance, and training. And a lot of those issues are very much handled by our global practice and also in partnership with other GPs in the World Bank. And it's very fulfilling work in our ability to support these governments. But we're also committed to make sure that our tools that we develop based on these engagements are widely accessible. I'm pleased to share that our PPP Knowledge Lab and the PPP Legal Resources Center are highly trafficked sites, and our PPP certification is the industry standard that ensures that professionals are well trained to identify value for money and are versed in the intricacies of PPPs. Our global platforms like the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility, or PIAF for those who know it, is a trust fund that is housed and brings developing country governments, helps build capacity, strengthen policies and regulations and institutions, and helps enable sustainable infrastructure with private sector participation. You could actually point to almost all countries in the developing world who have been developing their PPP frameworks, and you will see, PIAF work in supporting them. Our other global platform, the Global Infrastructure Facility, is helping provide financing and technical assistance for proper project preparation to make them bankable and I think we need to scale up these efforts. And we know in some cases PPPs are the best way to deliver infrastructure services, but in others they might not be the right approach. So we are introducing more tools like the Infrastructure Prioritization Framework and the PPP Fiscal Assessment Model, which we developed with the IMF, and both available online, are trying to help stakeholders get one step closer to making better informed decisions about infrastructure investments. Past experience also tells us, Nancy, that many governments will eventually turn to infrastructure spending to stimulate their economies. So it's very important for us to remain vigilant and provide support and strong decision-making inputs to help governments take the right decisions. We should not let this crisis go to waste. We must be more transparent in helping governments do that. We must target key areas of sustainability in terms of social benefits and inclusion, gender, job creation, as well as climate and environment. This global pandemic is shining a spotlight on the need for new generation of investments and we need to help countries achieve their development goals efficiency without wasting resources. And we're going, of course, to continue providing the necessary support to governments. So my team, for example, since March has been holding brainstorming sessions with national PPP units and government representatives in every region, so that we get a sense of how they're faring and allow for knowledge sharing among peers, so we can adjust and adapt to the circumstances we're facing. We've maintained this intense level of engagement by creating a virtual global PPP community forum. We've launched through our global platforms, both PF and GIF that I referred, respectively, specific fast track support so that we can help governments undertake fast assessments that the COVID-19 impact has affected their PPPs, as well as conduct the necessary market soundings to revalidate whether the projects can go to market. Finally, I'm cautiously optimistic that this is a moment when we can make even more progress towards achieving a more sustainable and resilient infrastructure, especially in moments like this, Nancy. I think we know that the quality infrastructure development helps protect lives, livelihoods, and the very future of the countries we're trying to support.
Thanks so much, Imad, for that really helpful overview. So, and you talked about how the bank is responding to its clients with all of these knowledge tools, and in particularly in this COVID era. So now I want to turn to Raphael as one of your clients and ask Raphael. So what is happening now, as you know? We're in this era of enormous fiscal challenges for many countries, really all countries. So on the one hand, you want to spend more on infrastructure as a stimulus tool. On the other hand, you have these, greatly heightened social needs and health spending needs. What is actually happening in Peru in terms of infrastructure spending, particularly private finance for infrastructure? And based on the report's findings, procurement regulation is an area in Peru where there's room for improvement. Are you, in the midst of this crisis, are you able to move forward with improvements to procurement regulation?
Yes, I mean, I think there's always room for improvement in regulation, and by the way, I want to thank the World Bank and PF. They have been very, very supportive of us in trying to in our efforts to enhance the regulation, and but also very flexible in understanding what are our priorities in the short run. I think we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we, in dialogue with the PIAP team, we identify some specific areas where we need help, and let's focus with some low-hanging fruits, right? And that's how we started about a year ago, and that was great. But then we also, when the COVID crisis started, and I think the rapid response program was also great to help us as we were trying to understand what was the change in the game. And from our perspective as a procurement P3 agency, we wanted to sense, of course, trying to get the pulse of the market on whether we should pause, think, or continue with some of the projects in our portfolio. And it was great to have that support from the PIAF, the assistance from PIAF, to take up, I would say, a sort of a cold eyes review of how our projects, and whether this is the right time to, or whether there's a fatal flaw that we should reconsider in the context of COVID-19. So I think it's great to have that support from the World Bank, very down to earth, and then on the enhancements, I think that we're pursuing. At this point, again, we're trying to do things that have an impact. I think we already have a good framework by concept. As I said, we have more checks and balances. From my perspective, it makes my life a little bit tougher, but I understand that isn't the benefit of having a better product at the end. But I do think the enhancements are more in having better divisions of responsibility and reducing the overlap. Because many other agencies involved in the process may add make it more complicated. But I think the enhancements are there on one hand, on better division of responsibilities. And then I think there's also enhancements in the early stages of the development process, which is with the ministries, the Ministry of Transportation, of Housing and Water and Sanitation. And we are also working on that in the case of, for example, the Ministry of Housing, Water and Sanitation. We are working, and again, here the PIAF is also supporting in defining terms of reference to engage a PMO to support the ministry with the early stage of the process on the formulation or pre-investing phase, if you would call, before they reach to move into the transaction phase. So again, the objective is to have better baked project on an early stage, and then when they move into the transaction, into structuring the transaction, it's in better shape. And so then we have less delays, and then we go into the market, right? But this PMO intention is also to support the ministry from early stage transaction and then go into execution, would give more continuity and also bridge some gaps in terms of technical capabilities and project management skills that may not be present in some agencies, in some government agencies at this point. So those are some areas where we're working right now, and we're very helpful. Or I think we're hopeful that we will show and will allow us again to strengthen the process and run better, more robust projects that reach the market and don't hit roadblocks later on, if I may say.
Thanks, Rafael. That's a really helpful sort of description of your perspective. And now I want to turn back to our private sector representatives for their reactions, Anne-Marie and John. And in particular, I wanted to pick up on this notion of large-scale institutional investment in infrastructure, which many have pointed out makes sense because infrastructure assets have, kind of moderate, steady returns, but they're long-term returns, and there's a good match between institutional investor assets and liabilities. So I'd like to ask both of you, is that realistic? We are not seeing a lot of institutional investment in emerging markets and certainly low-income economies. Is it realistic that there would over time be access to this large amount of finance, and maybe particularly for green investments, because we've seen that institutional investors really are very interested in green investment and sustainable development goals. And then as countries pursue these regulatory reforms, what do you want the developing finance institutions to do to make those flows from institutional investors, or to help make those flows possible? So is institutional investment realistic in emerging markets infrastructure, and how can the DFIs help? So maybe first Anne-Marie and then John.
Great, thank you. So that's a big question, a big couple of questions. So I'll try to be as focused as possible on my response. So essentially, I think the good work that the World Bank is doing together with its partners in terms of information availability, right? So I think investments in infrastructure and some of the PPP prior to recently is there was, I guess, a great degree of information asymmetry. And so therefore it was, perhaps maybe not as, well, the transparency and just the availability of information to make an investment decision was not as good as it could have been. So I think they've, as I said, the World Bank and its partners have made very good progress in terms of bringing, being more transparent, bringing, the information to the market so that it can make investment decisions. The next thing, of course, is just predictability, right? And so that's where these very strong regulatory regimes, I think, are enhancing the investment prospects of these projects. Of course, some very fundamental aspects, which I think are detailed in the report, rule of law. Generally, these projects need to be, financed in hard currency in order to bring these investors in. I think we've already touched on allocation of risk. Much of that really depends on termination payments, and how those are defined, and essentially what goes into those termination payments. And really very strong KPIs with respect to the actual performance of the investments. In terms of sort of the investment cycle, let's say, where really institutional investors are not really geared for taking construction risk. So basically what we've seen, and by the way, we've been very active in Peru. Thank you. Essentially, the commercial banks come in with structuring, taking the construction risk, and then once the projects meet certain milestones, then it's more so they're more appropriate or better, perhaps for institutional investors to come in. And then the commercial bank can then, sort of recycle its balance sheet and go to the next, project. So really, having a very strong financial advisor to structure the deal, with the view that it will bring in institutional investors at a later date. We are seeing interest from investors, in that, with that view. One of the challenges, and we've discussed this in the Global Infrastructure Facility, which we're a private sector partner in that effort, is really how do we bring a bit more homogeneity into these investment so that we can create an investment class that investors, these institutional investors, understand. And they can, if they need to trade out of it for whatever reason, as opposed to book and hold, they have that capability, which I think is, each country is unique. But if we're trying to establish, some sort of investment class, there needs to be some sort of underlying, I'd say, baseline or benchmark that these, any of these projects that go into, say, a portfolio would need to meet. There is an example, which again, we've discussed in the Global Infrastructure Facility, give it another plug, is the Clifford Capital portfolio, where several banks contributed or sold some of their infrastructure assets into this portfolio that then, in the attempt to sort of create perhaps a tradable portfolio of infrastructure investments. And then in terms of green investment, yes, that is very much on the forefront in our minds, where we where we are looking to invest more in these types of assets. And again, our bank has built an expertise in these kinds of investments and pitching to sell to our institutional clients. And then finally, in terms of what the DFIs can do to assist, really, it seems to me that if there's some sort of a backstop facility that DFIs can create, where inevitably things will go wrong, right? And if there is a backstop, whether it is in the form of sort of a not a dispute resolution type facility, because I'm not thinking of arbitration, but something that's more mediation, I suppose, would be the better term. So either a mediation stop, but then also having some sort of facility where these projects might hit a bump, that there is some sort of a shock absorber that the DFI can contribute. Obviously, there must be some mechanism for them to, once the project gets back on track, it will need to be reimbursed, repaid. But to my mind, having some sort of shock absorber that the DFIs could create for these projects would help in bringing in institutional investors. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that. Very good response to a very broad question. And you've raised the issue with respect to bundling somewhat homogeneous projects into an asset pool and an asset class that institutional investors would find attractive, which is something that a number of people, including in the G20, have focused on. So I want to pursue that a little bit. Maybe, John, you could comment on that, and then come back to the local currency issue, because as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, the investments from external investors need to be in hard currency, and this mediation backstop, which is a very interesting point as well. So, John, what's your list?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of what DFIs can do, I think the DFIs have been doing this for a long time, and it's a progressive thing that happens in iterations. They react very well to changing market conditions, and they have been very innovative in terms of trying to, I'm going to plug it for a third time, Anne-Marie. The Global Infrastructure Facility is again a great sort of example of what's happened there. I think what's interesting about the moment is we're living in a world that's been flipped upside down by COVID, and we haven't really talked about it too much yet. COVID has rapidly disrupted the sort of temporary use of infrastructure as we've seen it. Digital is way up. I mean, it's obvious from what we're doing right now. Transport is way down, and energy is sort of out of balance in terms of where demand traditionally is at different times of the day and where it usually is. And I think reacting to that sort of challenge is a very good stress test for public-private partnerships and for infrastructure financing overall. And so the idea of revenue protection, or providing that security blanket that Anne-Marie was talking about, I think is a critical sort of function, because in normal times, these projects should pay themselves off just by their very use. In times like this, extraordinary really as they are, we need the public sector, whether it's the multilateral development banks or national governments, to respond in a way that provides some sort of security to the services to ensure that they continue to be provided despite the fact that the revenues may be way down. And that's another conversation that happens in a lot of corners at the moment around resilience. I know for my colleagues in the International Development Assistance Services and in our global infrastructure practice, resilience is a big topic about how do we make infrastructure more resilient, not only to natural disasters like hurricanes and such, but also to economic situations like we find ourselves in at the moment. And all of this is leading to something else that Anne-Marie was talking about, which is the objective is to build towards an infrastructure asset class. And the only way that you get to an infrastructure asset class is through benchmarking and building portfolios of like-for-like assets. And so I was on a conversation this morning with United for Smart Sustainable Cities. They've got an interesting exercise that they're going through at the moment with many cities around the world around creating that sort of standardization in terms of the actionable indicators or metrics that cities can act on in order to address their deficiencies against the Sustainable Development Goals. As a result, that then leads to projects that they can develop in order to invest in and improve their performance against these goals. And if everybody's building those and developing those projects along the same sort of framework or standardized framework, you'll get an aggregated opportunity in the future where you'll be able to take portfolios of assets like that and put them into some sort of vehicle, which is not that dissimilar to what Anne-Marie was talking about with Clifford Capital and what they did in Singapore with project finance debt, and then really, create what would become a liquid tradable infrastructure asset class.
All right, well, so just pursuing that a little bit further, I want to ask both you and Anne-Marie, who should drive the creation of the asset class? Should it be the private sector, or should it be the development finance institutions? And you may say both, but the G20 has called on the multilateral development banks to do this, and I don't know that there's been a huge amount of progress. Who do you think from the private sector side should drive it? And both John.
I'll go first this time, Anne-Marie, because I think that the question is going to then land on you, because if you look at the Clifford Capital example, it was the Singapore government, a sovereign wealth fund, and the market all coming together and creating this solution. And so it has to be a collaboration. So I have to sit on the fence and say everybody has to come to the table and agree. It's not one segment of the market's responsibility to it.
I agree that everyone, the different segments do need to come together. So maybe a slight nuance to that is to say who's going to be sort of the project sponsor or the project manager on this, right? So in terms of a particular institution, whether it be in one of the DFIs, so basically sort of say, okay, this is my role. I'm going to take responsibility for getting this done, right? So which I think, plugging again, the Global Infrastructure Facility is perhaps very well positioned for that. I suppose one of the challenges is that of course we all have many responsibilities, right? So in terms of and I hate to use this expression, but sort of my day job versus okay, well, here's this other aspect that I want to get done, which is maybe more in the medium term, right? So I think that's really probably where the DFIs are probably best positioned to actually be the project sponsor or the task manager. Maybe I'll put it that way. The task manager to sort of lay out what the project scope is, and actually get everyone on board, and then actually drive it, right? In terms of saying, okay, I'm the conductor, I'm the driver on this.
Okay, then yeah, I mean, it's complicated, and it's a collective action kind of challenge, and many actors have to come together. So I'm going to turn to you, Ahmad, now, not to put you on the spot, but the multilateral development banks are the only institutions that have literally all of the tools to bring to bear, at least from the public sector side on this. There is the knowledge products that you were referring to before, the public goods. So there's lots of technical assistance, which I'm sure Peru and other countries have benefited from, as Rafael said. There are project finance tools that they can bring to bear, both on the public side and on the private side. There are political risk-sharing tools. There are other kinds of risk-sharing tools. There's sovereign lending to support policy and institutional reform. So there's no institutions that have that array. So how but traditionally it's been hard to bring all of those tools together. So I wanted to ask how the bank is doing it, because I know that the bank is very focused on this whole of bank approach. And then what do you think the bank's role is in terms of building this asset class as one of the actors that has to be in the lead?
Thank you, Nancy. Let me just actually make a few comments on this, and I want to also use my experience. I mean, and close to 30 years, and put that in terms of, you know. So I spent a long time as you know, being in the public sector, being a minister, and then I moved recently to IFC and then to the World Bank, and in my entire career. And I want to start with the government perspective because I think this is very important. We're always struggling in government. You know, how do we create more with less, and how do we crowd in more resources? And this is very much at the heart of what we're trying actually to discuss today, to leverage and maximize the ability to leverage private sector solutions and creating markets while basically optimizing the use of scarce public resources and ensuring that we reduce or the debt levels or not have them, you know, go in the wrong directions. This is very much, you know, at the heart of ownership by governments, you know, and governments having the political will that they want to, you know, to take the necessary reforms, which are going to be very critical, so that they can enable, you know, and to remove all these binding constraints that prevent, you know, the efficient public investment management frameworks to kick in, the proper prioritization and selection of projects, and the ability to maximize crowding in private sector solutions and commercial financing and institutional investors and so on. This is not an easy task. We have to be very realistic about that. It takes time and a huge effort actually to do that. But I can attest, you know, to you the commitment that you mentioned that the World Bank Group is trying to bring with a, you know, a continuous improvement model where we are trying as part of, you know, all MDBs and in partnership with the international community, with the client countries that we serve, in partnership with the public, private, and civil society organizations. There's a role for all of us here, and we have to involve all the stakeholders. But as a World Bank Group approach, we're very much committed to fundamentally make sure that infrastructure is accessible by all people. This has to be the primary goal of infrastructure. It has to be a great equalizer. It has to allow more workers access jobs, more students access the light they need to study at night, more people to access the life-saving medical care, and more lagging regions and firms to be able to access markets. So this One World Bank Group approach, I think, is critical to maximize the development resources to achieve, you know, the SDGs and the development objective. This is what is, you know, called the, you know, the MFD agenda, and our work to support the private capital mobilization. I think early on, there's a huge amount of work that has to come at the upstream level that we've discussed to enable all these reforms at the policy, legal, institutional, regulatory levels. And that takes a lot of hard work at the macro fiscal level to ensure, you know, much more sustainability, at the sector levels to make sure that sectors are financially sustainable, fiscally sustainable. Otherwise, the scaling up is not going to work because you're going to run out either, you know, with fiscal constraints, or you're going to have limitations in terms of ability. So there is a period of, since these agendas were declared and announced, that there's going to be a huge amount of investment that is needed by governments with the support of MDBs, donors, etc., that they are actually investing properly in these upstream enabling requirements and creating the necessary PPP and private participation ecosystems, so that then you can scale up the ability to do that. It's that level of de-risking that is going to be critical, because you're going to always run into a limitation in terms of just de-risking few projects that are PPPs. To me, that's the bigger investment that has to happen by all countries in the developing world, so that you could actually then do the necessary. This is where actually, you know, the World Bank Group comes in with its, you know, development policy loans to kind of unlock and incentivize governments to do the necessary reforms at the macro, at the sector, and creating the necessary private participation ecosystem and enabling environment in countries. And then we come in, of course, with the help to create the bankable pipeline of projects. And we come in with the help to properly prepare projects. And we come in also with the necessary then targeted credit enhancements, guarantees, political risk insurance, where the World Bank, IFC, MIGA come in under their respective roles to provide that support. This is very much how we're trying, in essence, to do that. So in summary, I think our support is ultimately about helping the public sectors in our client governments in consultation with the private sector, civil society, to become better at designing, the clear infra strategic vision, to build a sound pipeline of prioritized and bankable and fiscally affordable projects, to be better at coordinating within and across levels of government, as some of our speakers have said, to create sound institutions that work in a coordinated way, laterally and horizontally, to create robust sector regulatory regimes, and finally, infuse a strong culture of integrity and transparency across institutions. That's going to be critical.
Thanks. That's a really lucid description of all of the elements that have to come together and the role that the bank could play. I'm struck by my experience at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which creates these country compacts, which really are aimed to bring exactly these kinds of elements together: the policy and institutional reform, the technical assistance, and the project finance. In the case of MCC, mostly public project finance, but that is one mode for doing this, is to create these country or sectoral compacts. Okay, well, we are actually getting some questions from the audience, which I want to move to, so we can pose them to our group here. But before we do that, if I could just turn briefly to Fatuma Toure Ibrahima, who's the practice manager of the PPP group for the World Bank's Infrastructure Finance PPP and Guarantee Department, because I just wanted to give her a brief opportunity to comment before we move to those questions. Fatuma.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And while colleagues take a few minutes to prepare their question, I just wanted to come in and really thank the team for the opportunity. I'm pleased to see the outcome of the team's hard work on this initiative, as well as the partnership with institutions like those represented on the panel today to advance the infrastructure agenda. So I have one comment and a quick question. The comment is really to acknowledge the power of partnership, because to provide high-level quality infrastructure that close the infrastructure gap, we need to come together and rely on partnership. And the pandemic is really squeezing public finances all over the world, and private participation in infrastructure is declining. So it forces us to really acknowledge that power of partnership, not only in terms of finding private sector solutions, but also in terms of knowledge sharing. And this is really something that is critical in the context of the work that the team has done today. And many panel members have referred to the different segments coming together. There were also references to many of the global platforms within the PPP, the infrastructure finance PPPs and guarantees group, like PIAF and GIF. So for me, the power of partnership is really a comment that I wanted to put on the table. On the question, there were a couple of references to security blanket and security of services. John and Anne-Marie have really put forward a number of points related to the role of PPP practitioners in supporting innovation and better decision-making. So I would like really to ask a question about better decision-making, especially in the time of COVID. We can see that there is concentration of effort in infrastructure investment, and they need to play a stimulus role in the path to recovery from COVID-19. So it would be interesting to hear from our two private sector representatives on what they see as a critical change in decision-making process to support prudent and resilient infrastructure. They have alluded to it, but it would be good to hear from them on terms of their last recommendations on this. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Fatou. So perhaps our private sector representatives would like to respond to that. And then I have 3 really very good questions for the audience I'd like to pose to the panel. Please go ahead, Anne-Marie and John.
Okay, well, I mean, I suppose, so yes, I suppose some of the challenges of decision-making in COVID, of course, is that, you know, we're not able to be on the ground, right? In terms of, you know, so the usual due diligence that, you know, that we think of doing, you know, before we make an investment decision. You know, there are certain technology, you know, sort of that we can use. You know, hearing of using drones, for example, to at least do a, you know, I guess a type of site visit. So I imagine that in terms of better decision making in time of COVID, it's just it will be more, I guess, reliant on you know, face to face, let's say, you know, through this technology, and you know, becoming creative in terms of how we can address the, you know, the very necessary aspects of conducting due diligence, and you know, getting a feel for the project and the risk. I think one of the things that that we're seeing is that you know, we're seeing much more discussion about, you know, as you say, building back better, I think is the you know, the phrase that we're using. It's okay, so how do we do this in a more environmentally sustainable way, right? So how, you know, I mean, let's not do what we've been doing, right? You know, all along, let's see how we, you know, the better piece of it, right? And you know, what I'm seeing from banks and I assume institutional investors as well, is that when it comes to you know, credit decisions and profitability decisions, if projects fall into a green bucket or a sustainability bucket, then there is a factor of such that sort of you know, enhances the internal view of the profitability of a particular investment, right? So it's not simply, you know, we're all looking at our models and you know, what can we do to adjust it to take into account perhaps the intangible. You know, I mean, we're not going to see it in terms of, you know, sort of the actual revenue probably, but I mean, we have to factor in what is currently perceived as being the intangible of you know, more sustainable investment, and so that's, you know, trying to monetize that in a certain way within models.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that could be a role for the development banks to try to quantify and monetize those externalities, social and environmental, and create project return numbers that incorporate those. Very briefly, John, if you could just jump in, but I'm very conscious of the time, and I want to get to audience questions.
I'll be quick. I think the point that you just made is an excellent point. I think that the multilateral and development banks have been trying to do this quantification for a lot longer than private sector equivalents like SMBC. And so I think there's a lot that we in the private sector can follow from what they're doing. KPMG Impact, which is the business now that I'm part of within KPMG, we've got an emphasis on measurement, assurance, and reporting. And again, just to build on what Anne-Marie said, the importance of better data will give us better decision making. And so how do we get that data? How do we provide assurance on that data? There is a technology element to that. We're looking at blockchain for climate accounting infrastructure. You know, this is all being driven by stakeholders, as Anne-Marie said. And I think we cannot underestimate the importance going forward out of COVID of non-financial information alongside traditional financial metrics.
Yeah, very much agree with that. That's a really good point. Okay, so I'm going to bundle questions here. So For the team, for the report team, we have two specific questions. One is, how have countries actually reacted to the report, to the scores? Have they reacted that this is a useful exercise, and have they adapted their policies in consistent with the report's findings? And the second is, how did you select the 40 countries for the pilot on PPPs? So that's for the team. And then I want to come back to this question of that I think Raphael initially raised, that in order to improve the quality of projects, you have to expand the stakeholders within a government and the touch points in assessing the projects, which can delay things. So, and actually create the capacity to veto projects by more entities. So how do we deal with that? So first, project team, Fernanda, on the receptivity to the findings and the selection of the 40 countries.
Okay, so to be honest, I cannot say much about the reaction because we are launching it today. So while we made it publicly available a couple of weeks ago, was really internally. So today, I think from now on, we will start to hear the reactions. What I
think they meant to previous reports.
Exactly. What I can say about the previous one is that in general, obviously, we have the big winners here, the countries that score very high, and have used them basically to show, I think, the stakeholders in general that they perform well, and they benchmark themselves to because we don't do rankings basically, so they rank themselves and show that as part of information. In terms of reforms, basically, I think we have received a general feedback. You always want reactions from the countries, no? So we have the reactions about the discussion about particular good practices that they adopt, and then we have that discussion and I think clarifications that help them to identify the areas in which they can improve. If you see between 2018 and 2020, there have been many reforms, and that I think shows that this is important. So. In general, we have received very good feedback in general and useful, and I think we see reforms, which for us is the way to measure that this is working. With respect to the 40 countries pilot, the way, if you see in the map, actually it looks like cover a lot of the globe, and this is exactly because by definition, basically what we try to do is to cover all the regions, so have samples for all the regions in the world, and we went for the biggest economies in the countries, because usually bigger economies have bigger PPP programs and therefore TPI programs, and we had a better coverage there. But there is nothing basically. Will this be representative? Of course, we will need to upscale in the next edition and see if the results that we are showing today holds when we increase the sample. But the way in which we try to do was basically cover all the regions and the big economies. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so just as a final word, we only have about 2 minutes left. If I could ask all of the panelists to comment broadly on this question, the project quality and timing, and project uptake by the private sector. How do you think about that when you broaden the number of stakeholders that can assess a project? How does that really affect the quality of the project and the likelihood of private investment? So maybe, yeah, let's start with Raphael on that one.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's not an easy answer. I guess I would say, so we have this more structured framework, but that's a framework, right? I think there requires some work to be done inside the Proinversión, for example, right? And we're working on some of that, right? Because there's a learning curve to make things to flow easier. So we are working on some fronts. Inside, we are having more structured processes to make the process more predictable. both inside and for the other stakeholders, right? So when they receive the documents for approval, they know, okay, where to focus attention, right? I think that's something that it's a learning process and we're working on it. It's not easy. The other is that I think I already mentioned is better division of responsibility. Who is responsible for that? Who gives opinion on what? Because the initial reaction in a government official is, okay, I receive a document, okay, I check everything, right? So that's something that we need to work, and then better project management, what I would call project management approach, right? We are doing more monitoring, identifying the critical path, making everybody aware who is holding things up, and that's something that we are, and actually the World Bank has been supporting us as well on some tools to do this properly. And finally, I think there's one that is tough, and we haven't mentioned yet, but definitely had an impact in our region, right? Which is the corruption scandal. I mean, Lavallato, it definitely had an impact on the trust. So we're talking about partnership, right? When there's no trust, things don't flow. So I think there's an effort to rebuild trust alongside PPPs. I think we had a good run with PPPs in the region, and then we hit this scandal, which tarnished the process, and it has created, like, we have some trust to rebuild among all the players inside the government, but also with the private sector. We need to rebuild that, and I think that's an effort. It's I think we're working on that, but it may take some time, and we need to do, and transparency is going to help.
Thank you. All right, 2 seconds each for the remaining panelists. John.
Yeah, I'll go next quickly. I only have 4 words: standardization, multi-party, multilateral, and collaboration. And yes, trust circled all around all of those.
Excellent, excellent. Somebody should tweet that. Anne-Marie.
Yes, great. So going back to Ahmad's comments earlier, de-risking, right? So the more a project is, or more a situation is de-risked, the better outcomes for all parties. Although I will say, the timing has it can't be, it needs to be time bound, let's say. If you don't have access to water, you need water, right? So we can't have these endless de-risking activities. Thanks.
That's a great point too. All right, Ahmad, you have the last word.
Thank you, Nancy. I mean, just to add to everybody, listen, 2 points. The first is actually, to do this properly, you have to have a right nexus coming together. This is, the PPP framework with the way actually what we call the explicit and funded government support mechanisms that government brings in to support private sector participation, with the overall public investment management framework and the overall fiscal commitments and contingent liabilities framework. These have to come together properly in a country in the right way. And I think Rafael knows this very well, that if these things come in well, you can scale up, and this creates the necessary interactions across government with the private sector and so on. The second part, obviously, is that specific actions to crowd in, the commercial and the institutional investors. These are very much, expanding pipeline development and proper project preparation, promoting standardization, as we said, scaling up the use of credit enhancements as need be, working with the private sector to create aggregation platforms, and finally enhancing alignment and disclosure around environmental and social and government safeguards.
Thanks, Ahmad. Let's end on that. I want to thank the report team for a wonderful contribution to mobilizing finance for infrastructure. And I want to thank all of the panelists for really an excellent conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you and have a good day.